What happens when a prince, a man whose very life is defined by titles, tradition, and the expectations of an entire monarchy, walks onto a stage and is refused the respect that has been drilled into him for decades? Imagine that moment. Imagine standing under bright studio lights, cameras rolling, millions of viewers watching your every movement, and the one thing you believe you are owed, the acknowledgement of your status, is flatly denied. That is exactly what happened when Prince Harry made a surprise appearance on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. And from the moment he set foot on that stage, the atmosphere was tense, electric, charged with the potential for drama, embarrassment, and a confrontation that no one anticipated. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. If you think this was just another celebrity late-night visit, think again. This was a collision of worlds. A royal used to centuries of protocol meeting the irreverence of modern American talk show culture. A clash of tradition and casual irreverence, poised to ignite a media storm. And for Harry, someone who has spent years navigating the delicate balance between his private life and public duty, this moment was more than a simple televised appearance. It was a test of patience, of pride, and perhaps of control itself. From the very beginning, there were signs that this visit would not go as expected. The announcement was sudden, catching both the production team and the live audience by surprise. No teaser tweets, no prior hints, only a cryptic line on the teleprompter that sent whispers through the control room. Prince Harry will join Stephen Colbert live. Can you imagine the tension in that room? The producers, the crew, the audience. They all knew something extraordinary was about to unfold, but no one had a clue how Harry would respond, how the chemistry with Colbert would play out, or what unscripted moments might emerge. Every eye in the studio turned toward him when he appeared, and the collective intake of breath was palpable. There is something viscerally fascinating about watching a figure of royalty navigate a space that is inherently democratic, irreverent, and unpredictably human. And then, the first sign of friction. Colbert, ever the master of comedic timing, greeted him with his usual charm. But the greeting skirted around formality. The words, "Your Highness," were absent. A small omission? Perhaps. But to Harry, it was monumental. Titles are not just words. They are symbols of centuries of tradition, markers of identity, and reminders of one's place in a world that has often demanded perfection, decorum, and loyalty above personal comfort. When that acknowledgement was withheld, it was not simply a matter of etiquette. It was a provocation, intentional or not, that sparked an immediate reaction. In that moment, millions of viewers were about to witness not just a conversation, but a subtle battle of respect, ego, and expectation. But before we dive into the details of the interaction itself, let's consider why this matters now. Prince Harry is not just any guest. He is one of the most scrutinized members of the British royal family. His every action, from casual gestures to public statements, is dissected by media outlets around the globe. His life is a series of contradictions, royal yet outsider, public yet intensely private, loved by some, criticized by others. The refusal to address him as Your Highness might seem minor to the casual viewer, but in the context of his ongoing struggle with media intrusion, his recent distance from royal protocol, and his public battles over respect and autonomy, it becomes explosive. It is emblematic of a broader tension, one that resonates far beyond the studio and into the hearts of millions who follow his life. How does a man reconcile his need for respect with the freedoms he desires? How does one maintain dignity when tradition collides with modernity in the harshest of spotlights? Even before the cameras started rolling, whispers began circulating online. Fans speculated about what Harry would say. Critics debated whether he would confront Colbert. Insiders hinted at nervous production staff and tight security, aware that the smallest misstep could spiral into a global headline. And then, when the cameras began rolling and the lights illuminated the stage, it became clear that this was no ordinary appearance. Harry walked onto that stage carrying decades of expectation, personal history, and the unspoken pressure to perform not just as a prince, but as a man aware that every action, every word, could be interpreted, misinterpreted, and dissected across continents. Let's pause and ask ourselves a question. What would you do if you were in his shoes? You are a figure of immense stature, but also immense vulnerability. You have spent your entire life conditioned to expect a certain form of recognition, a certain level of acknowledgement for your identity. And yet, in front of millions of viewers, that acknowledgement is withheld. Do you laugh it off? Do you confront it? Or do you simmer in silence, letting the moment stretch and expand with its own tension? For Harry, the answer was complicated. And watching his response unfold would reveal layers of personality, frustration, and perhaps a deeper commentary on the pressures of being a modern royal. As the interview continued, subtle signs of tension emerged. A shift in posture, a pause in speech, a tightened jaw. The audience, though largely unaware of royal protocol, could feel the undercurrent of unease. Colbert, skilled as he is in reading a room, noticed the shift, but whether he fully understood the stakes is unclear. Here was a man used to commanding respect through heritage and history, confronted with the casual informality of a talk show host. The clash was subtle but undeniable, and it set the stage for what would become an unforgettable sequence of exchanges. Every question Colbert asked, every anecdote he shared, carried additional weight. And as Harry navigated these moments, the tension in the room grew, building like a storm on the horizon. But it wasn't just the live audience that felt the tension. Millions of viewers at home were about to witness a moment that blurred the lines between public persona and private emotion. In the world of late-night television, unexpected confrontations are rare, but here, the stakes were unlike anything typical. This was a royal, a man whose life is defined by ceremonial tradition, suddenly navigating a landscape where the usual rules didn't apply. Every movement, every inflection of tone, became a statement, whether intentional or subconscious. And that is where the drama lies, not in what is overt, but in the subtleties, the quiet flashes of anger, discomfort, and pride that reveal a deeper human story. And yet, even as tension mounted, there was an undercurrent of humor, irony, and absurdity. The juxtaposition of centuries-old tradition with modern, irreverent comedy created moments that were as awkward as they were compelling. Imagine the scenario: a prince accustomed to bowing, formal greetings, and measured speeches, standing under the bright lights of a New York television studio, confronted with a host whose charm is casual, whose jokes are biting, and whose approach to royalty is decidedly unceremonial. It is almost Shakespearean in its irony, tragedy and comedy intertwined on the same stage. But what truly makes this story resonate is the timing. Prince Harry is at a pivotal moment in his life. He has stepped back from active royal duties, sought autonomy in personal and professional pursuits, and publicly challenged the institution that once defined him. Every appearance, every statement, carries layers of meaning. The refusal to address him as Your Highness may seem trivial, but in context, it is emblematic of a broader tension, a struggle for respect, recognition, and individuality against the weight of centuries-old expectation. And as the episode unfolded, it became clear that this was not just a televised interview. It was a flashpoint, a moment where personal history, public expectation, and media spectacle collided with explosive results. Now, consider this. Even seasoned observers of the royal family were caught off guard. Those familiar with the meticulous choreography of public appearances, the carefully managed protocols, and the predictable interactions were suddenly witnessing unpredictability at its finest. Harry's reactions, subtle or overt, were being recorded, analyzed, and speculated upon in real time. Every gesture was scrutinized, every pause dissected. The smallest sign of irritation became a headline. And in a world where perception often outweighs reality, the consequences of this single appearance were already rippling outward, reaching far beyond the walls of the studio. And yet, despite the mounting tension, there is something compelling, almost hypnotic, about watching a figure of royalty navigate moments of vulnerability. Here is a man accustomed to command, now confronted with circumstances he cannot control entirely. His reaction is a mix of pride, frustration, and human instinct. For viewers, it is both captivating and relatable. It is a reminder that even those born into privilege and power are not immune to the basic human need for acknowledgement and respect. How do we, as observers, reconcile admiration for status with empathy for vulnerability? It is this tension that fuels the drama, sustains the suspense, and keeps audiences glued to the unfolding narrative. And now, as the cameras rolled, as Colbert engaged in his trademark wit, and as Harry responded with subtle cues, the stage was set for what would become an iconic moment in the intersection of royalty and media. What unfolded next was a combination of improvisation, protocol clash, and raw emotion. A sequence that would dominate headlines, ignite debate, and provoke strong reactions from fans, critics, and insiders alike. Every second mattered. Every glance, pause, and choice of words contributed to a story that was larger than the moment itself. A story about respect, recognition, and the modern challenges of being a royal in a world that increasingly values irreverence over tradition. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It all began on what seemed to be a completely ordinary night on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. The audience had arrived, cameras were rolling, and the usual banter between Colbert and the crowd was flowing smoothly. But there was a buzz in the air that nobody could quite place. Some attendees thought it was just the excitement that comes with being on a live show. Others assumed it was the kind of tension you feel when a big celebrity is about to appear. But the truth was far more electrifying than anyone imagined. The teleprompter flashed a line that no one in the studio could ignore. Prince Harry would be making a surprise appearance. Think about that for a second. You're sitting in the audience, and suddenly the possibility of seeing a member of the British royal family in person, a prince, someone whose every movement is scrutinized by the world, becomes reality. You might feel awe, curiosity, or even a hint of disbelief. And yet, few could grasp what that moment would truly unleash. From the moment Harry's name appeared on the teleprompter, the production team and the crew were on edge. Phones were pressed against ears. Whispers darted across the room like electricity. Is he really coming? What's the protocol? How do we handle this? Imagine the tension. Imagine the sudden spike in heart rates as everyone tried to prepare for an appearance that was as unexpected as it was unprecedented. Harry himself, by all accounts, approached the situation with a mixture of anticipation and wariness. Here was a man who had spent decades conditioned to certain rules, certain expectations, and certain forms of deference. And now, he was stepping into a space that fundamentally rejected those conventions. How does someone trained in centuries of ceremonial tradition navigate the unpredictability of American late-night television? That question would set the tone for every second he spent on that stage. The surprise announcement was more than a mere publicity stunt. It was a calculated disruption, whether orchestrated by the show's producers or merely the result of scheduling logistics. The audience had no warning, and the element of shock served a dual purpose. It heightened curiosity and magnified tension. Everyone in that room instinctively knew they were about to witness something significant. And as the realization settled in, anticipation hung thick in the air, almost as tangible as the studio lights themselves. Imagine the first few steps Harry took onto that stage. Cameras panned, lights flared, and an audible ripple went through the audience. There was a moment, a brief, almost imperceptible moment, where the collective breath of everyone present seemed to pause. The prince, whose life had always been mediated through layers of staff, protocol, and media filtration, was suddenly raw and exposed in front of the American public. Every gesture he made, every subtle movement, would be amplified by millions of viewers at home, and every micro-expression would later be dissected by fans, critics, and pundits across the globe. The stage was set not only for an interview, but for a performance of identity under pressure, where every second mattered. From the audience's perspective, the initial greeting was smooth enough. Colbert, ever the consummate professional, welcomed Harry with his signature mix of humor and warmth. But as anyone familiar with royal protocol would know, the subtleties mattered. Titles are not merely ceremonial. They carry weight, symbolism, and centuries of cultural reinforcement. And when Colbert casually sidestepped the title, Your Highness, the ripple of tension that followed was instantaneous, if subtle. Most of the audience might have missed it entirely, but for Harry, the omission was striking. It was a small detail, but in the world of royalty, small details carry enormous emotional and psychological weight. Meanwhile, backstage, the production team scrambled to adjust. Cues had to be recalibrated, camera angles shifted, and even the teleprompter was slightly altered in real time to accommodate the evolving energy on stage. There was a palpable sense that the ordinary rules of television production were insufficient for the moment at hand. And in that chaos, one thing became crystal clear. No matter how prepared anyone thought they were, this appearance was not going to be ordinary. But let's pause for a moment and consider the audience at home. Millions tuned in expecting a lighthearted, entertaining segment. A royal on a talk show is already a spectacle, but the stakes were higher than mere entertainment. Here was a man whose life had been defined by media attention, controversy, and the constant balancing act between duty and personal freedom. His every appearance carries layers of meaning, sometimes invisible to casual observers, but unmistakable to those who understand the pressures of his life. And in this context, a simple greeting, or the absence of one, became a catalyst for drama, an emotional trigger loaded with historical and personal significance. At the same time, the world outside the studio was already reacting. Social media lit up with speculation and anticipation. Fans tweeted their excitement. Pundits analyzed the potential impact. Royal watchers debated what the appearance might reveal about Harry's current relationship with the monarchy. And in that digital sphere, the tension magnified exponentially. The appearance was no longer just a television event. It had become a global narrative in motion, a story unfolding in real time across multiple platforms, each interpretation feeding into the next. Harry's approach to the stage was deliberate. He knew the cameras were on, he knew millions were watching, and he understood that first impressions would carry enormous weight. Yet, unlike other media appearances, this was unscripted to an extent. There were no clear guidelines on how Colbert would interact with him, no guarantees that the traditional respect he had grown accustomed to would be observed. And that uncertainty, perhaps more than anything, contributed to the intensity of the moment. It is one thing to navigate a scripted royal engagement. It is another entirely to confront unpredictability in front of millions. And then came the first exchange. Colbert, with his customary wit, opened the conversation with a casual remark about Harry's recent endeavors, completely sidestepping formal titles. For some, it might have seemed harmless, even humorous. But for Harry, whose identity had been shaped by both expectation and tradition, the slight was not trivial. Titles are more than words. They are a recognition of position, responsibility, and legacy. To be denied that acknowledgement, even in jest, carries emotional resonance. And so, the tension that had been building since the announcement of his appearance found its first focal point. Backstage, security and production staff were acutely aware of the stakes. Harry's reputation for measured composure belied the intensity of his personal reactions to perceived slights. There was an unspoken understanding that one misstep could escalate rapidly, that the appearance could turn from a televised interview into a spectacle of publicized conflict. Cameras had to be ready to capture every moment. Producers had to anticipate contingencies, and everyone involved had to stay alert for signs of discomfort or escalation. And while the audience witnessed only what was visible on stage, the emotional currents were far more complex. There was excitement, anticipation, curiosity, and tension all coexisting in a single space. The unpredictability of live television combined with the presence of a figure so heavily scrutinized created an atmosphere ripe for unscripted drama. For Harry, every gesture, every smile, every pause was not merely a performance, but a negotiation with history, expectation, and public perception. And for the audience, that made every second of his appearance both fascinating and fraught with suspense. The surprise announcement, therefore, was more than just a setup for an interview. It was the first spark in a chain reaction that would escalate into a moment of confrontation, subtle or overt, that no one in that studio, or watching from home, could have anticipated fully. It was the opening act in a drama that combined elements of tradition, modern media, personal identity, and public scrutiny. And as Harry moved further into the spotlight, it became clear that this was not just about a conversation with a talk show host. It was about respect, recognition, and the delicate balance between public expectation and personal dignity. Every eye remained fixed on him as he took the stage. Every camera zoomed, Every microphone captured the nuance of his tone. And yet, despite all the preparation, all the anticipation, and all the tension, no one could predict how he would respond to the subtle provocation that was about to unfold. That moment, the first real point of friction, would set in motion a sequence of events that would dominate headlines, ignite debate, and spark conversations across the world. But it all began with the surprise announcement, the unexpected entry onto the stage, and the quiet, almost imperceptible signal that history was about to unfold in a way no one expected. And then, as Harry's presence settled into the studio, the audience, the crew, and the viewers at home could feel the energy shift. The anticipation was no longer theoretical. It had become tangible. The prince had arrived, and with him came a tension that was palpable, charged, and ready to ignite. But what came next? The moment that would turn curiosity into shock and tension into confrontation was about to unfold in a way that no one in that studio could have predicted. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. From the moment Prince Harry stepped onto the stage, there was an undercurrent of unease that rippled through the studio. At first glance, it might have seemed like a typical television moment. A guest walks in, the host greets them, cameras roll, and the show progresses. But anyone paying attention could sense that something was different. There was an electricity in the air, a tension that went beyond the bright lights and the hum of the audience. It wasn't just that a royal was on the show, it was how he moved, how he held himself, how every small detail seemed to carry weight far beyond its surface meaning. Consider Harry's posture as he approached the seating area. His back was straight, shoulders squared, yet there was a subtle stiffness, a barely perceptible tightening around his jaw. Observers with an eye for body language would have noticed the way his eyes scanned the room, alert, assessing, anticipating. He was conscious of every camera angle, every microphone placement, every member of the audience watching him. This was a man accustomed to scrutiny, yes, but the intensity here was different. There were no palace walls, no staff to buffer him, no scripts to follow. Just him, Colbert, and the glaring inevitability of public attention. In that instant, the ordinary dynamic of a talk show interview became something far more charged, a negotiation of power, respect, and personal boundaries. Stephen Colbert, for his part, approached the situation with the kind of casual ease he is known for. He smiled, delivered his usual opening line, and tried to set a tone of lightheartedness. But subtle cues betrayed the fact that even he sensed the tension. There were micro-pauses in his speech, slight shifts in his posture, and a careful modulation of humor that suggested he was navigating a new, delicate terrain. For Colbert, this wasn't just another celebrity interview. It was a real-time study in etiquette, psychology, and the unpredictable emotional responses of a man whose life has been heavily scripted and monitored. And then came the first hints of friction. The greeting, though friendly, skirted around formal recognition. Colbert referred to him simply as Prince Harry, omitting the traditional Your Highness that the prince would have expected. For viewers unfamiliar with royal protocol, this might seem like a minor oversight, a casual and formal greeting. But in Harry's world, titles carry profound meaning. They are not just words, they are markers of identity, symbols of responsibility, and reminders of legacy. To be denied that acknowledgement, even inadvertently, was like a subtle challenge, a quiet test of patience that few would have dared to administer in such a public arena. And Harry's reaction, though initially restrained, hinted at the inner storm brewing beneath his composed exterior. The audience, of course, remained largely unaware of the significance. For them, the moment appeared polite, cordial, and entertaining. But behind the scenes, every twitch of a muscle, every slight narrowing of the eyes, was magnified. Security personnel shifted slightly, subtly adjusting their positions, aware that the prince's comfort and composure were paramount. Production staff leaned into their monitors, eyes darting between screens, noting the ebb and flow of tension. It was as if the studio itself had become a pressure cooker, each small movement, each subtle interaction, contributing to an escalating heat that no one could fully control. And yet, Harry maintained his composure. There was a deliberate precision to his movements, a conscious effort to navigate the unfamiliar terrain of a talk show set with dignity. He smiled when appropriate, nodded in response to Colbert's questions, and maintained eye contact with the host. But beneath the surface, there was a simmering tension, a quiet insistence that his presence, his identity, and his expectations be respected. It was a delicate balance. How to assert authority without appearing aggressive, how to maintain dignity without alienating the audience, how to respond to subtle slights without creating an incident. For anyone observing closely, the scene was a masterclass in restraint under pressure. Consider, too, the psychological weight of the moment. Harry is a man who has spent his life negotiating public perception. Every gesture, every word, every decision has been scrutinized and interpreted. And now, on a live American television show, he was navigating a new set of variables, a host known for irreverence, a culture less rigidly bound by protocol, and an audience that might not understand the nuances of royal expectations. The stakes were high, and the margin for error was slim. In that context, even small deviations, like the omission of a title, became flashpoints for tension, emotional spikes waiting to be triggered. As the interview progressed, the first cracks began to appear. Harry's responses, initially measured and polite, grew slightly more guarded. There were subtle hesitations in his speech, brief pauses where he seemed to collect himself, and occasional glances toward the audience that conveyed a mix of awareness and assessment. Colbert, perceptive as ever, noticed these shifts, though he could not fully comprehend the underlying causes. The interplay between host and guest became a delicate dance, each movement carefully calibrated, each line of dialogue carrying layers of subtext that extended far beyond the surface conversation. And the audience at home? They were completely captivated. Millions of viewers were witnessing what appeared to be a smooth, engaging interview. But underneath the surface, a storm was brewing. Social media buzzed with anticipation and speculation. Fans dissected every clip, every expression, and every word. Pundits debated whether Harry's demeanor signaled irritation, fatigue, or subtle rebellion. The narrative was unfolding on multiple planes simultaneously, live on stage, in the control room, and across the digital universe. And with each passing second, the tension ratcheted higher, the stakes became more palpable, and the anticipation of conflict grew. Even the most mundane exchanges between host and guest carried weight. A joke, a casual remark, a simple observation became a potential spark for misunderstanding or escalation. And Harry, aware of every nuance, navigated the terrain with a combination of careful attention and subtle assertion. There was an intelligence to his restraint, a strategic calculation that balanced pride, dignity, and the desire to maintain control over how he was perceived. But even with such careful management, tension has a way of manifesting in unexpected ways, often through micro-expressions, fleeting gestures, or a shift in tone that only the most observant could detect. Then came the moment when the tension became almost tangible. It wasn't a dramatic outburst, nor was it an overt confrontation. It was subtler, more psychological, a pause that stretched a fraction too long, a tightening of the jaw, a flicker in the eyes. The kind of moment that tells you that beneath the surface, the emotional currents are far stronger than the polite conversation suggests. And for those who understand the pressures of royal life, the implications were immediate. A man accustomed to being recognized, to being acknowledged, to being treated according to centuries of tradition, was quietly and unmistakably registering that a line had been crossed. Colbert, still performing with his trademark ease, made a joke, lightly attempting to ease the tension. The audience laughed politely, but Harry's response was measured, almost careful, as if testing the waters before deciding how to react. It was in that moment that the subtle battle of wills began. A test of patience, a negotiation of respect, a silent dialogue about identity, authority, and recognition. And it was just beginning. Because while the initial signs of tension were subtle, the stage was being set for something far more dramatic, something that would capture headlines, dominate social media, and spark debate around the world. Meanwhile, the production staff were acutely aware that things could escalate at any moment. Live television is unpredictable by nature, but the presence of a royal, someone trained to expect a particular level of formality, added an entirely new layer of complexity. They monitored the cameras, the audience, and Harry's subtle movements, prepared to adjust in real time. Even a slight shift in energy, a micro-expression, or a change in tone could signal a breaking point. And in a world where perception often outweighs reality, the management of such moments is critical. And then there was the audience. Those watching at home might have seen a composed, polished interview, but the live audience could feel the undercurrent of tension. Every laugh was slightly delayed, every cheer slightly muted. People leaned forward in their seats, aware that they were witnessing something more than entertainment. They were witnessing the subtle unraveling of a carefully constructed public persona. The energy in the room was electric, and it grew with each passing minute. But the first overt signs of conflict were still to come. The small, almost imperceptible tension in the opening moments was only a prelude. The stage was set. The cameras were rolling. Millions of eyes were watching. And the prince, whose life has been a careful dance between public expectation and personal desire, was about to face a subtle but undeniable challenge, one that would push the boundaries of patience, decorum, and composure. And just as the audience thought the interview would proceed smoothly, the first words came that hinted at what was to follow. Colbert, unaware of the emotional weight behind every syllable, made a choice. A choice that would set in motion a series of reactions that no one could have predicted. It was a small moment, a seemingly casual line of dialogue, but in that room, under those lights, with those stakes, it was enough to ignite the next phase of tension. But what happened immediately after would make everyone in that studio, and millions watching at home, realize that this was no ordinary talk show appearance. It was a moment so small, so deceptively simple, that to the casual observer it might have seemed inconsequential. Yet, in the context of centuries of tradition, expectation, and personal history, it was nothing short of explosive. The phrase, or more accurately, the absence of it, was enough to ignite a subtle but unmistakable spark. Colbert did not address Prince Harry as Your Highness. At first, the omission might have seemed like a trivial detail, an oversight in a fast-moving conversation. But for Harry, it was a signal that despite the lights, the cameras, and the millions of viewers, the recognition he expected, the acknowledgement he believed was owed, was being withheld. Think about what that means in the life of someone who has been trained, practically from birth, to expect a certain level of formality and deference. Every greeting, every bow, every protocol observed has been a small reinforcement of identity, hierarchy, and respect. Remove that acknowledgement in a public, highly scrutinized moment, and you are not merely omitting a title. You are subtly challenging the person behind it. You are sending a message. The rules you live by may not apply here. And Harry, no stranger to the intricacies of respect, protocol, and personal boundaries, immediately felt the weight of that omission. At first, his reaction was contained, measured, almost imperceptible. A slight narrowing of the eyes. A brief pause before responding. A micro-expression that suggested, I see what you're doing. Those trained to read body language could detect the shift, a slight tightening of the lips, a subtle elevation of the chin, a posture that moved from casual engagement to deliberate poise. It was the body signaling the mind, pay attention, something is off. And though Harry's voice remained calm, polite, and measured, the energy in the room had changed. The audience, unaware of the history behind such an omission, interpreted the shift as a moment of tension, but they could not fully grasp its significance. And yet, the power of this moment was not solely in what was said, or not said. It was in the collision of two worlds. Colbert operates in a culture where irreverence is expected, where comedy thrives on casual familiarity, and where formalities are often set aside for entertainment. Harry operates in a world where every word, every gesture, carries historical and symbolic weight. The missing Your Highness became the fulcrum on which this clash pivoted. It was more than etiquette, it was identity, pride, and the subtle assertion of personal dignity. As the exchange continued, Harry's responses became carefully calibrated. There was a slight edge, an underlying firmness to his tone, as if he were asserting, without overt confrontation, that this small oversight mattered. He did not explode, nor did he retreat. Instead, he navigated the moment with a precision that conveyed both restraint and silent authority. To the audience, it might have appeared as composure under pressure. To insiders and those familiar with royal protocol, it was a clear signal. The rules of recognition, respect, and hierarchy were being tested, and Harry was not about to let them be ignored. Consider the tension in the room. Colbert, sensing subtle shifts, tried to maintain his trademark humor, carefully steering the conversation while remaining aware that his usual approach might be having an unintended effect. The audience, sensing something different, leaned forward, caught between curiosity and anticipation. Social media, which was already buzzing from the surprise appearance, began to explode with speculation. Clips from the segment circulated, with fans and commentators dissecting Harry's posture, tone, and reactions frame by frame. Within moments, the absence of a single phrase had become a global talking point, proving just how sensitive and charged such a seemingly minor omission could be. And Harry's reaction was far more complex than simple irritation. Behind the poised exterior was a swirl of emotion. Frustration, pride, awareness of the audience, awareness of the cameras, and a deep understanding of the historical weight carried by every gesture. In that split second, he balanced the expectations of the public, the informal approach of Colbert, and his own personal standards of dignity. It is a delicate psychological act. To project composure while internally processing the subtle slight, to maintain control while signaling, in a nuanced way, that the interaction had crossed an invisible line. The audience may have missed the nuanced signals at first, but they could feel the tension growing. The laughter was a bit slower, the applause slightly hesitant, the energy in the room charged with anticipation. Even Colbert, seasoned in managing live interactions with celebrities, realized that he was navigating an entirely new territory. The dynamics of respect, protocol, and cultural expectation had collided in front of millions of viewers, and both host and guest were acutely aware that the smallest misstep could escalate the situation. It is in moments like these that subtleties become everything. Harry's slight lean forward, the controlled modulation of his voice, the fleeting micro-expressions. All of it was a silent conversation layered over the spoken dialogue. He was communicating something unspoken yet unmistakable. Acknowledgement matters. Recognition matters. And if that is withheld, even in jest or oversight, the omission carries weight far beyond what the casual observer might assume. And then came the first direct moment of tension in the dialogue. Harry, with a carefully measured tone, made a light, almost imperceptible reference that highlighted the omission. Not a confrontation, not a demand, but a subtle signal, a reminder to Colbert, the audience, and the millions watching at home. It was a masterclass in controlled assertion, a way to convey authority without aggression, to correct a perceived slight without creating a scene. Yet the effect was immediate. The atmosphere shifted. You could almost feel the air tighten in the studio. The audience sensed it. Colbert sensed it. And the subtle drama of protocol versus informality began to unfold in earnest. At the same time, the production crew and security were alert. While the exchange seemed polite on the surface, they understood that these moments could escalate rapidly. They watched Harry's gestures, monitored his expressions, and prepared for any unexpected reactions. Every slight twitch, every shift in posture, every measured pause was scrutinized, not out of suspicion, but out of awareness of the high stakes. This was more than an interview. It was a dance of decorum, power, and emotional nuance, performed live in front of millions. The audience at home may not have realized the historical context behind the moment, but the ripple effect was already beginning. Clips of the exchange circulated online, analysts debated the implications, and royal commentators dissected every syllable. The absence of a single phrase, "Your Highness," was being framed as a flashpoint, a moment that revealed the subtle tensions between royal expectation and modern media culture. And within those minutes, what seemed like a small oversight had transformed into a defining narrative. A prince's dignity was being tested on live television, and the world was watching how he would respond. And yet, Harry's approach remained remarkably composed. He did not raise his voice, he did not lose his temper, and he did not abandon the conversation. Instead, he navigated the interaction with precision, balancing the weight of tradition with the unpredictability of live television. His every move was deliberate, signaling both awareness and control. And that is what made the moment so compelling. The combination of subtle frustration, silent assertion, and calculated poise created a tension that was almost unbearable to witness. The audience could feel it without fully understanding it. The world was watching a man negotiate respect under pressure, a negotiation both delicate and intense. And just when it seemed the moment might pass, that the subtle tension had been acknowledged and contained, Harry made a small, almost imperceptible gesture. A tilt of the head, a controlled shift in posture, a pause that stretched just slightly longer than necessary. It was enough to signal to everyone in the room that this was not over, that the missing Your Highness mattered far more than anyone could have predicted, and that the dynamics of the conversation had shifted irrevocably. But what came next, the subtle yet unmistakable escalation of tension, would shock the studio, the audience, and millions watching from around the world. To understand why the missing Your Highness during Prince Harry's appearance on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert caused such a profound reaction, we need to step back and examine the long, intricate history of royal etiquette. Royalty isn't just about crowns, palaces, or public appearances. It is a complex system of tradition, hierarchy, and symbolism that has evolved over centuries, shaping how monarchs and their families interact with the world and, crucially, how they are expected to be treated. Every title, every bow, every protocol carries layers of meaning that Harry has been immersed in since birth. From the moment a royal is born, they are enveloped in a world where language and address are codified. Your Highness is not a mere courtesy. It is a declaration of status, a marker of position within a lineage that stretches back generations. It is recognition of responsibility, authority, and duty. To omit it in public, intentionally or otherwise, is more than a slight. It is a subtle signal that the person's societal and historical role is being questioned. Think of it as a shorthand for respect, centuries of expectation distilled into two simple words. When those words are withheld, the omission resonates far beyond the surface interaction. Consider the origins of these protocols. European courts, particularly in Britain, developed intricate systems of etiquette during the medieval and early modern periods. Titles, forms of address, and ceremonial behavior were codified to reinforce hierarchy, prevent conflict, and maintain order. In these tightly controlled social environments, even small breaches of protocol could carry serious consequences, from minor embarrassment to public scandal. Royals were trained rigorously in these systems from an early age, ensuring that every interaction reinforced the structure that supported their position. Harry, like his forebears, grew up in this world of meticulous expectation, where respect was not merely requested, it was demanded and ritualized. This background explains why the omission of Your Highness is not trivial. To an outsider, Colbert's casual phrasing may have seemed like normal talk show informality. But to Harry, it was a moment charged with historical and personal significance. It was a subtle disruption of the hierarchy he has been taught to navigate from birth. In the highly publicized context of American television, the absence of proper address was amplified, transforming a minor conversational oversight into a moment of emotional and symbolic weight. Every royal who has participated in public life understands that acknowledgement of title is deeply entwined with recognition of identity, authority, and respect. Even small deviations from protocol have historically caused ripple effects. There are numerous documented cases where minor breaches of etiquette led to public outcry or royal displeasure. A host neglecting a formal address, a photographer positioning themselves incorrectly, or a dignitary failing to follow seating protocol could, and did, trigger waves of controversy. For modern royals, who are constantly under public scrutiny, these minor breaches are magnified. Harry, navigating a new life in the media spotlight while maintaining a connection to royal tradition, was uniquely positioned at the intersection of these pressures. It is also important to consider the psychological dimension. Titles and forms of address are more than cultural artifacts. They are deeply tied to identity. When someone repeatedly experiences recognition or the lack thereof, it reinforces or undermines their sense of self. For Harry, whose identity has been shaped by both privilege and the challenges of royal scrutiny, The omission of Your Highness carries layers of personal resonance. It touches on themes of respect, acknowledgement, and the validation of his role within a system that he has both been a part of and at times distanced himself from. Historically, royals have navigated these delicate situations with a mixture of diplomacy and strategic response. The balance between maintaining dignity and avoiding public scandal has always been critical. A pointed correction could be perceived as arrogance, while silent tolerance might suggest weakness. Harry, in this televised moment, faced a similar dilemma. He had to respond to the slight in a way that upheld his personal standards, maintained his composure, and considered the global audience watching every gesture. The stakes were not simply about a title. They were about the intersection of tradition, identity, and public perception. Royal etiquette also encompasses behavior beyond verbal acknowledgement. Physical gestures, posture, and even the timing of responses all communicate respect or its absence. In the studio, Harry's posture, micro-expressions, and controlled responses were all part of a silent dialogue, signaling both awareness and measured authority. Every slight tilt of the head, every pause in speech, every subtle gesture carried significance, reflecting the centuries of training and expectation embedded in royal behavior. The missing Your Highness thus became a catalyst for a cascade of emotional and behavioral responses, each amplified by the medium of live television. Additionally, the context of American media culture added another layer of complexity. Unlike British royal events, which follow rigid protocols, American talk shows thrive on informality, humor, and relatability. Hosts are expected to break down barriers, to treat guests as approachable personalities rather than ceremonial figures. Colbert's approach, while normal in American television, collided with the centuries-old system of recognition that Harry had been steeped in. It created a perfect storm. Tradition versus modernity, expectation versus irreverence, identity versus entertainment. The contrast between these two worlds, royal protocol and casual American media, is central to understanding the intensity of Harry's response. He was not reacting merely to the omission of a phrase. He was navigating a collision of cultural systems, each with its own rules and expectations. The subtle tension that arose on stage was, in essence, a microcosm of the broader challenges Harry faces in his public life, maintaining personal dignity and identity while engaging with a world that often misunderstands or disregards the protocols that have shaped him. Furthermore, historical precedence shows that moments like these are rarely isolated. Small breaches of protocol often escalate, if not carefully managed. Courtiers, advisors, and household staff historically intervened to prevent minor slights from snowballing into public scandal. In Harry's modern context, his team, the production staff, and security personnel played the same role, subtly monitoring and managing interactions to prevent escalation. But live television, with its spontaneity and immediacy, provides little room for traditional buffering. Every response, every hesitation, every subtle correction occurs in real time, with millions of witnesses. And so, the missing Your Highness was not simply an oversight. It was a trigger, a historical, cultural, and personal flashpoint that revealed the intricate interplay between tradition, identity, and public performance. It illuminated the challenges of being a modern royal in a world that often values irreverence over respect, informality over ceremony. And for viewers, the moment was fascinating precisely because it combined subtle historical context with real-time human emotion. But as the interview continued, the tension that had begun with this omission was far from resolved. The historical weight of royal etiquette had set the stage, but the unfolding interactions between Harry and Colbert were about to take the stakes even higher. The moment that seemed small in isolation was only the opening act of a sequence that would escalate in ways no one could have predicted. And just when the audience thought they understood the dynamics, the next interaction would ignite an intensity that would leave the studio and millions of viewers completely riveted. The moment Prince Harry set foot on the Late Show stage, a delicate tension was already brewing. But as the conversation progressed, another factor began to stir the pot. Stephen Colbert's subtle provocations. Unlike overt confrontations that demand immediate response, subtle provocations are designed to unsettle, to create discomfort, and to elicit reactions that reveal hidden emotions or hidden truths. In Harry's case, Colbert, knowingly or unknowingly, began deploying these small psychological nudges, each one intensifying the emotional complexity of the live interview. Consider the first of these provocations. Colbert, with a trademark blend of humor and casual familiarity, referenced an aspect of Harry's recent public life, his decision to step back from royal duties. At first glance, it seemed innocuous, even complimentary. But beneath the surface, it carried a subtle implication that Harry's departure from royal responsibilities was a choice open to public judgment. In Harry's world, personal decisions are never simple. They are public statements scrutinized by millions. The subtext of Colbert's comment was clear. The world is watching, and even in a seemingly informal setting, your choices can be subtly questioned. Harry's response was polite, measured, and precise. He nodded, smiled faintly, and replied with carefully chosen words. But his eyes betrayed a momentary flicker of irritation, a micro-expression that spoke volumes to those trained in reading body language. The provocation had landed, even if he maintained composure. And that, in itself, is the hallmark of a subtle provocation. It elicits a reaction without overtly breaking the rules of polite discourse. It is psychological chess played in real time, and Harry was now a key player in this high-stakes game. Then came the next provocation, more layered and complex. Colbert casually made a joke about media coverage surrounding Harry and Meghan Markle, specifically hinting at perceived public misunderstandings or exaggerated narratives. For the average audience member, it was a harmless quip. For Harry, it was loaded. He has spent years navigating a minefield of media speculation, dealing with misrepresentation, and defending his family against relentless scrutiny. The joke wasn't just humorous. It was a subtle challenge, a reminder of the external pressures that accompany his public life. Harry's reaction this time was even more controlled. He maintained a polite smile, carefully modulating his tone, choosing words that acknowledged the statement without conceding any ground. It is an exquisite example of live emotional management, projecting calm while internally processing layers of slight, challenge, and implication. In that moment, viewers may have missed the significance, but anyone familiar with royal protocol, media training, or public relations could recognize the tension as both intentional and unavoidable. Colbert's subtle provocations were not random. They followed a pattern, building in intensity with each passing moment. One minute he would casually omit a title, the next he would lightly poke at media narratives, and shortly after, he would make humorous references that simultaneously acknowledged Harry's public image and tested his patience. Each statement was carefully calibrated to provoke a reaction without overtly forcing one. It is a skill that seasoned hosts develop. Eliciting authentic responses from guests without crossing ethical lines. But when your guest is a royal trained to navigate centuries of expectation, the stakes are dramatically higher. Harry's internal calculus was complex. On the one hand, he wanted to maintain composure, protect his family's reputation, and avoid unnecessary conflict. On the other hand, each provocation struck at deeply personal and historical sensitivities. Recognition, respect, and the constant scrutiny of the media and public. Balancing these competing priorities required extraordinary mental agility. Every pause, every controlled gesture, every carefully chosen word was a negotiation with both self and audience. Meanwhile, behind the cameras, the production staff were acutely aware of the building tension. They observed Harry's subtle reactions. A slight tightening of the jaw, a micro-frown, a fleeting glance toward Colbert that carried both assessment and restraint. Each of these cues required quick interpretation. Was this a signal that escalation might occur? Could the next provocation push him past composure? The team adjusted camera angles and lighting subtly, ensuring that the audience could perceive these nuanced emotional shifts, even if they weren't fully conscious of them. The studio became a theater of psychological tension as much as a platform for entertainment. Colbert, ever the perceptive host, may have recognized some of these cues unconsciously. His humor, his timing, and his delivery subtly shifted with each micro-expression he detected. While maintaining his persona of casual wit and irreverence, he was navigating a psychological minefield, testing boundaries while ensuring that the conversation remained within the realm of a televised interview. The interplay between host and guest had become a sophisticated dance, each move measured, each gesture loaded with meaning, each word carrying both literal and symbolic weight. As the provocations continued, Harry demonstrated remarkable control. He did not snap, he did not publicly rebuke, and he did not retreat. Instead, he engaged in what can only be described as strategic diplomacy. Acknowledging points without conceding authority, smiling without surrendering pride, and subtly signaling, through micro-expressions and pauses, that he was fully aware of the dynamics at play. Every member of the production team could sense the skill involved in maintaining this equilibrium. The tension was palpable, yet perfectly contained, like a high-wire act performed without a safety net. The audience, both in the studio and at home, were partially aware of the heightened energy. While many interpreted the interaction as a blend of humor and charm, those attuned to nuances of etiquette, media dynamics, or body language sensed an underlying current of friction. The global conversation began immediately. Clips of Harry's responses circulated online. Debates emerged over whether he appeared irritated, composed, or subtly assertive. The narrative extended far beyond the walls of the studio, illustrating the power of subtle provocations to create ripple effects across multiple audiences. Even seemingly minor jokes became battlegrounds. Colbert, for instance, lightly referenced Harry's time in the military, suggesting humorous anecdotes about protocol, discipline, and authority. On the surface, it was a light moment designed for laughter. But beneath that humor was an implicit acknowledgement of hierarchy and recognition. Again, themes central to Harry's lived experience. Each joke, each casual reference, became a subtle negotiation over identity, respect, and public perception. And yet, Harry remained composed, demonstrating extraordinary emotional intelligence. His measured pauses, carefully chosen words, and controlled micro-expressions revealed not only restraint, but also an acute awareness of audience perception. In a way, his reactions were a silent dialogue, communicating awareness and self-respect without overt confrontation. Every subtle provocation, met with a calculated response, elevated the interaction from a casual talk show appearance to a study in high-stakes interpersonal dynamics. But as the provocations mounted, a critical question loomed. How long could Harry maintain this delicate balance? Every micro-challenge, every subtle omission, every layered joke increased the potential for emotional escalation. The interplay between expectation, history, identity, and public scrutiny was reaching a tipping point. The stage was set for a moment that would reveal not only Harry's composure, but also the raw emotional intensity that simmered beneath the surface. And just when it seemed that the subtle provocations might continue indefinitely, the next exchange would push the tension from the psychological into the almost tangible, creating a moment that the studio, the audience, and viewers at home would never forget. From the very first moment Prince Harry entered the late show stage, the live audience could feel the energy shift. Even before Colbert's subtle provocations began, there was an unmistakable tension in the air. It wasn't just curiosity or excitement. It was an anticipatory charge, as if the room collectively sensed that this would be no ordinary interview. Every eye followed Harry's movements. Every murmur hushed as he approached his seat, and even the laughter and applause carried a tone of cautious observation. Something significant was unfolding, and the audience instinctively knew it. To understand the reaction, it's important to consider the psychology of live spectatorship. When viewers, whether in a studio or online, sense a subtle conflict, a tiny disruption of expected norms, their attention is heightened. The absence of the formal title, Your Highness, acted as a trigger. Many in the audience may not have consciously realized why a single omitted phrase caused tension, but psychologically, humans are wired to detect deviations from social norms. The micro-expression, the pause, the controlled reaction. All of it was magnified in the shared attention of hundreds of live spectators. The audience became part of the experiment, unwittingly participating in a psychological interplay between respect, recognition, and subtle provocation. Early in the segment, polite laughter filled the studio. Yet even these light-hearted moments carried a nervous edge. Audience members leaned forward, heads tilted, eyes narrowing slightly as they processed each interaction. Whispers occasionally rippled through the crowd, questions muttered under breaths. Did he just notice that? Was that intentional? Is he annoyed? These murmurs were a reflection of a collective awareness that something delicate was happening, something requiring careful observation. Every chuckle and smile was filtered through a lens of uncertainty, amplifying the tension on stage. As Colbert began his subtle provocations, the audience's reactions grew more pronounced. A joke about media coverage, delivered with casual charm, earned laughter, but it was layered with hesitation. People were laughing, yes, but the pause before each response indicated that they were not entirely at ease. Their brains were processing multiple cues simultaneously: the humor, the guest's reaction, the broader social implications, and the cultural weight of the interaction. Even those unfamiliar with royal etiquette sensed the subtle imbalance and found themselves leaning into the unfolding drama. The studio audience's reactions were particularly fascinating because they mirrored a form of social cognition known as emotional contagion. Humans are wired to pick up on the emotional states of those around them. When subtle tension exists on stage, it ripples outward. Smiles become cautious, laughter becomes tempered, and the overall energy of the room adjusts to match the emotional tenor of the central figures. Harry's composed but tense responses acted as a focal point, creating a shared emotional environment in which the audience could sense that something significant, and potentially volatile, was simmering just beneath the surface.